On the 12th of May 2023, a dream of mine came true at last. That was when The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom finally released, and it had been my most anticipated game of all time up until that point. I plugged in the cartridge, saw the prologue, started playing, and immediately fell in love all over again with this world. I am confident in saying that the day Tears of the Kingdom released was my favourite day of the whole year, even more than my own birthday. So why am I making this video then? Why is it titled the way it is? Where have my newfound conflicting emotions on this game come from? Well, how about we find out the answer to that question together? A YouTuber who I'm a huge fan of, known as Arlo, once made a 3.5 hour long video essay about how much he adored Breath of the Wild. In July of this year, he decided to hold a live stream where you could talk to him about anything you wanted. I decided to ask him what he thought about Tears of the Kingdom, and, well, this is what he had to say.
It's alright. It's good. It's really good, but it's a little disappointing. It's a great game that I maybe don't appreciate as much as I should for how great it is, because it's not that much greater than Breath of the Wild, so there is kind of a been there, done that kind of feeling.
And I sat with that for quite a while, because somehow he knew exactly what I was thinking too. Clearly, my opinion about this game is not exactly in a minority. At the very least, a sizable proportion of the population think that this game has some major issues holding it back. Issues that I either ignored or didn't even consider in the first place back when it first aired. I think it was just recency bias. Excitement for the fact that we finally got a new Zelda game, and not just a new Zelda game, but the direct sequel of one of my favourite games of all time. And yes, this game is still one of my favourites. However, there is something bugging me about it. After all, I was initially going to make a 2-hour long love letter to this game. I even advertised it earlier on this year, saying I'm going to make a 2-hour long review all about Tears of the Kingdom to celebrate its 1-year anniversary, and it's going to be the biggest, most ambitious video I've ever constructed. That video never came to pass. I didn't want to admit it to myself back then, but I just didn't have the motivation to talk about the game for that long. Interestingly though, that was around the same time my feelings for the game started to turn. I stopped seeing it as an objectively flawless masterpiece. I stopped dismissing all of the people who had problems with it. And whether or not my past self liked it, I had become one of the critics. And I had never anticipated this when the game first came out. I was 100% sure that it would be the best Zelda game 10 times over. But that isn't exactly what this game is. Do not get me wrong, it does so much right. If it didn't, why on earth would I love it this much? If it wasn't even remotely good at anything it set out to do, why on earth would I hold it in such high regard? Well, that's what this video is going to explain to you, and hopefully by the end of it, I'll have a clearer idea of where I stand with this game.
Can you hear my voice? Ancient history will be renewed once again. Hyrule needs you.
Probably the thing I was most worried about going into this game was the reused world. After all, Breath of the Wild's whole thing was discovery. Not knowing what you were going to find builds anticipation because you wanted to discover something new. It was just so magical. All of Hyrule was a gigantic mystery, and this motivated you to explore the entirety of the map, wanting to find out what was there. And so, how was Tears of the Kingdom going to recreate this magic if the world was reused for the most part? Well, it does, kind of, but it also doesn't, if you know what I mean. Let me explain. Well, the thing is, the motivation to explore the world did end up changing, but I would say it wasn't exactly for the worst. Wanting to see what's changed in Hyrule since the last game is what motivated me to explore it, and at least for me, it was a pretty solid motivation. I really wanted to know what changed in Hyrule, and so I literally combed through every single nook and cranny of this world, skydiving off of the Great Sky Island, and then finally landing in Hyrule and seeing all of the differences made me excited. Everything looked so new. There was a giant tornado near Rito Village that I was really excited to check out. Hyrule Castle was floating. There was a new fort known as Lookout Landing right in the center of Hyrule. Chasms opened up around the world, which opened up to the depths below. It truly felt like an actual, honest-to-goodness sequel to Breath of the Wild, not just glorified DLC. Or at the very least, that's what I thought for the first 50 or so hours of the game. Because after I beat the main story and continued to explore all over Hyrule, I realized that this does feel pretty been there, done that. Things quickly became stale and repetitive, especially in the new areas of this game. Let's touch on the depths first, because they're arguably the most important addition. When you first go down there, the depths are honestly just so cool. The idea that there's an entire dark world equal in size and complexity to the surface is probably one of the best ideas I've ever heard. Or at the very least it is on paper. Because the whole thing with exploring the depths is lighting up the light routes all around to make everything actually visible. When you first go down into the depths, everything is completely pitch black. It is literally impossible to see anything. So you have to light it up yourself. But once you've done that, and then you continue to explore the depths, you realize that it's all the same. It's all just the same enemy camps, the same music, the same landscapes. Everything is just so dull and lifeless. I mean, the game itself doesn't even promote that much of a good use for the depths besides farming Zonite and the Master Koga side quest that you could do pretty quickly. I mean, I teleported literally from one side of the depths all the way to the other side, stretching out for miles, and it still looked exactly the same. And it made it genuinely hard for me to want to explore the depths because I realized that I'd pretty much seen everything there is to see. And the same is true for the Sky Islands, which was central to the game's marketing. To be fair, I really did enjoy them the first time around, but they're all so repetitive, and there aren't nearly enough of them to constitute it being such a central part of the narrative. But then again, maybe that's giving them a little bit too much credit, considering just how little we know about them. The Great Sky Island is probably the most involved, most complex, most deep one of them all, and that's the tutorial island. You'd think that this would serve as more of an appetizer, a teaser for things to come, but no, it's pretty much the only time we ever get to see a Sky Island that's even remotely interesting. That is if you exclude the story-relevant islands, which you'll have to go to no matter what, so it doesn't really feel like it counts for the discovery. Anywhere where the player didn't actually have to go felt kind of lazy and copied and pasted. I didn't feel like I was learning anything new about the Zonai from these Sky Islands. How could anyone possibly live here? What are these spilly thing platforms for? What was the point of everything here? And the answer the story gives isn't exactly good enough, but more on that when we talk about the story. The sky was disappointing because it just felt undercooked. Both the sky and the depths have the problem of being annoyingly bland. It all runs together in your mind, and so you can't tell any side of the depths or the sky from the other. This makes the new content feel very shallow and recycled. The most complex area in this game is, once again, the surface. But the thing is, I spent hundreds of hours exploring that version of Hyrule. I don't really feel the need to do so again. But because of how boring and repetitive the new areas of this game are, I am forced to stay here, tethered to this recycled content for hope that it'll be better. And yes, I would say it is a little bit better than the sky and the depths, but not by much. For the first 50 or so hours of the game, I'm really enjoying myself. I really enjoyed trying to see what's changed, exploring the story, all the new towns and everything, unlocking what the secrets of the geoglyphs are, finding new temples, shrines, etc, etc. But after that point, it becomes repetitive just like everything else. You realize that very little has actually changed. Hyrule is almost identical to the way it was before, and just because the way you traverse it is different enough doesn't necessarily mean that this landscape isn't disappointing. You know, the other day I was playing this game, like I do most days, and I was walking through Hyrule Field in the champion's tunic with the Master Sword. Then some bokoblins showed up, and I beat them. Then some moblins showed up, and I beat them too. And also, there was some Lizalfos, and I beat them too. And at that point I was wondering, am I just playing Breath of the Wild again? Because all of this is exactly the same stuff I was doing in Breath of the Wild. All of the same enemies, the same music, the same costumes, the same weapons, the same everything. It's moments like this that made me question whether or not this was a sequel to Breath of the Wild or a remixed version of it. And yes, the enemy variety has improved since Breath of the Wild, but not by much. You are still going to encounter the exact same enemies most of the time. But goblins, of all people, are going to dominate your playtime in terms of combat. And this was fairly disappointing for me. It honestly felt like they spent so much time refining and tweaking the new abilities to make sure that it worked properly that they forgot to make a game around it sometimes. Which brings us on to the next aspect of this game. It's undeniable that the reason this game took so long to develop was because of the new abilities. And you know what? I can commend the effort they put into it. Because, in my opinion at least, these abilities are so much better than Breath of the Wild's. So much fun to interact with different physics objects and the environment using these new tools at your disposal. It just makes for an incredibly enjoyable and fulfilling experience. Let's start with Fuse, which I'm sure was an absolute nightmare to develop, allowing you to stick on whatever material you want to a weapon, giving it new attributes and making it stronger. To me, this solved one of Breath of the Wild's biggest issues. I did not feel like I had enough of an incentive to actually fight enemies, because all I would get out of it was a broken weapon. However, now with this new Fuse ability, you can fuse the monster parts of the enemies you killed to your weapons, making them stronger. This means that the stronger the enemy you defeat is, the stronger your weapon will become. Very clever. However, it's not exactly the main attraction of all of the abilities in this game. Let's finally talk about Ultra Hand. The ability to stick together any object in this game to make contraptions out of them, it's just such a cool idea. Sticking stuff together to create a way to traverse your surroundings and take advantage of the materials around you is great. And it works flawlessly. Every single object in this game knows exactly how to interact with every single other object in the game. It doesn't matter how absurd the creation you try to make is, it will work the way you'd probably expect it to in our real world. And that's just absolutely amazing. I love it so much. It's probably my favorite aspect of this entire game, especially when the game first came out. I was just so enamored with the ability that I just did it for hours on end, creating robots and cars and vehicles like hot air balloons and flying machines, building little robots as my own personal minions to attack enemies in my place. This game is bursting with creativity at every corner, and in this aspect at the very least, I love the idea of fighting enemies and solving puzzles in my own special, unique, wacky and weird way. We'll get to why this kind of has a few detriments to it in the next section of this video, but for now, at least in regards to Ultra Hand and the other abilities, I love it. However, there is one big problem with Ultra Hand. It consumes a lot of resources. It uses quite a lot of Zonite and Zonite devices and materials that it's almost not worth making some giant contraption, because you're inevitably going to have to say goodbye to it sooner or later when you're traversing some underground crevice or some more narrow pathway and can't bring your amazing Zonai vehicle with you. And so I'm kind of discouraged from actually using the system. Not to mention that the uses for Ultra Hand in things like shrines and temples is always incredibly simple and surface level, but we'll get to that when we get to that. The ability to create giant Zonai mechanical war heroes is really cool, but you only really do that when you intrinsically want to. The game doesn't give you enough of a reason to do this outside of just for the laughs. And so Ultra Hand mainly just feels like a really fun gimmick, but a gimmick nonetheless. One that I utilized less and less as I kept playing the game because it felt kind of shallow. It didn't feel all that important to everything else the game was trying to achieve. It just kind of felt like a gimmick tacked on for the fun of it. Don't get me wrong, it is useful, very useful in certain situations, but the process of constructing these vehicles and using Ultra Hand isn't a very smooth process and almost doesn't seem entirely worth it considering just how many consumables it uses up. This isn't exactly the case for the final two abilities, and I have admittedly less to say about them here, but not because they're bad, just because they're a bit less interesting. Ascend lets you shoot to the top of any surface that you're standing underneath, which is very useful, especially when you've spent a lot of time traversing some kind of cave system and don't want to spend all that time backtracking your way out. And then there's the fourth and final ability, Recall, which allows you to reverse an object's movement. I feel like this one is kind of the anti-Ultra Hand. Instead of making things move, it makes things move backwards. In fact, it can become very useful when you pair it with Ultra Hand. If you want to get somewhere high up but can't figure out how, just use Ultra Hand to lift up a Zonai sled or something, then stand on it, then use Recall, and then you're set. It's entirely obvious that so much time, attention, and care was given to perfecting these abilities, and I really appreciate the team for that. However, I kind of wish that they spent a bit more time on, well, other aspects of this game, because honestly, mechanics can't exactly carry an entire game with them. And on that note, we move on to the title of this section of the video is a bit of a double entendre, as it were, because it doesn't just reference the shrines and dungeons of the game, but also how you get to them and how they're interwoven throughout the main quest. See, Regional Phenomena is the main quest that you're going to be spending the bulk of your time playing in Tears of the Kingdom. After finally getting off of the Great Sky Island, you go down to Lookout Landing, see Purah, then go see Zelda at Hyrule Castle, that's new. And then you go back to Purah and she tells you to go to the four corners of Hyrule to investigate what's going on in each of those regions. So, basically, it's Breath of the Wild again. It's Breath of the Wild with a different coat of paint, if you will. Except only now, everyone's just slightly older and you're doing slightly different things. Honestly, considering how long this game took to release, I was hoping things would be a little bit more different this time around. But no, it's the exact same formula as last time. And while I wasn't initially disappointed with this when I first played the game, resentment kind of grew over time. Especially during my second playthrough. During that playthrough, I realized just how formulaic all of these four main quests are. They're incredibly repetitive as well. Go to one of the four main regions, talk to the sage, then they go do a whole thing with the temple, and then all of a sudden, oh wow, ancient sages, let's tell them about the distant past 4 times in a row. Get ready to hear the phrase Secret Stone Demon King on loop forever and ever. And then they become a sage, and then you get their new sage ability, which is very awkward to use in the overworld, I might add. All of the puzzles are just as loosely designed as they were in the predecessor, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're poorly designed, does it? Well, I wouldn't say so, I suppose, despite the fact that you can skip most of them with a Zonai vehicle. The puzzles in and of themselves are fairly intriguing. I mean, it got my brain working a little bit at least. And because I've grown and matured since my last playthrough, I did not use a guide. And to be fair, there were some interesting puzzles at play here. However, it wasn't really all that interesting considering how easy they became after a while. Because Tears of the Kingdom's mantra is absolute freedom. You're not tied down to any one specific playing style or one specific way to do something or solve a puzzle. You can do it in whatever way you want, and this is a blessing and a curse. I've already talked about how this kind of thing can be great in the last section, but this is where things tend to get a little bit terrible. Because of this focus on open-ended stuff, they can't actually structure the dungeons in a way where each puzzle builds on a different one. They're all just self-contained, isolated little vignettes that just solve themselves. And this makes things a little bit more shallow. There was quite a lot of merit to the linear puzzles in previous Zelda games. The benefits of restriction are numerous. You can't just cheat your way out of a puzzle, you actually have to fulfill the obligation set before you and use your brain to figure out how. But in Tears of the Kingdom, this is completely neutralized by all of the freedom, and this is exemplified best by the shrines in this game. There are well over 150 shrines in this game, which is quite a lot if I do say so myself. And most of them focus on using your abilities in a few key ways and manipulating the environment within the shrines to suit each given puzzle. But the thing is, you have other ways to use these abilities that completely trivialize all the puzzles. Many shrines revolve around trying to get somewhere where it's really high up. You can use the tools that the shrine itself gives you, or you can exit, fuse a rocket to your shield, come back, use the rocket shield to get a lot of height, and then freely glide right down to where you need to go. And that's it. That's the puzzle. You are not penalized for this. In fact, the game rewards and encourages it by having the puzzles be fulfilled in this weird wishy-washy roundabout manner, and it kind of devalues the satisfaction you get. At first, when you see the way a puzzle is supposed to work and you decide to do it your own special way, that is pretty intriguing and you do feel pretty proud of yourself when you succeed. But then with each passing shrine, with each puzzle that you completely cheat your way out of, you become more dissatisfied with yourself and with the puzzle. You start to wonder what the point of these puzzles even are if you could just cheat your way out of them all the time. They stop feeling like puzzles and start feeling like tiny little meaningless activities that get you a blessing at the end. Puzzles and dungeons and shrines are some of my favorite aspects of these games. I love the idea of being in some kind of self-contained little pocket universe that tests you in very specific kinds of ways. And you can fulfill the obligations set before you in the way they expect you to. Don't get me wrong, you don't have to completely trivialize everything with a rocket shield, but the fact that you even have the option to means I'm always going to be tempted, which is the problem here. It's another example of Tears of the Kingdom's philosophy about absolute freedom no matter the cost. And I feel like this principle attacks the story of the game in a very horrible way. And this is probably my biggest disappointment with the game. So let's explore that, shall we?
Still you mortals dare stand against my iron command. Weakness will always lead to defeat by I, the superior man.
Alright, here we go. This is the part of the review I've been dying to get to, because this was the part of the game that I have always been the most enthusiastic about, for better or worse. Stories are the most important part for any Zelda game in my eyes. They give context to the adventure that I'm going on and make me genuinely care about what I'm doing in the game. It turns it from just a mindless digital simulation designed only to give me short-term satisfaction and gratification into a truly mesmerizing, sometimes emotional, gripping experience, the likes of which I will never forget for the rest of my life. So where does Tears of the Kingdom stand when it comes to this kind of philosophy? Just like a lot of other aspects of this game, the way I feel is relatively complicated. There are some great ideas here, don't get me wrong, but I feel like the way that these are executed kind of leaves a bit to be desired. Let's take Zelda's traversal right into the past. I really like the whole cyclical time loop thing they've got going on, what with the murals that were obscured at the start of the game actually revealing Zelda's story into the past, revealing it was set in stone all along. It's some really nice narrative foreshadowing that genuinely got me when I first realized what was actually happening. And these memories of Zelda in the past are genuinely endearing. I especially loved Queen Sonia and her relationship that she had with Zelda, being the mother that Zelda never really had, considering her real mother died when she was very young. I also quite like Rauru as a character. The idea that he's the first king of Hyrule is a very weird idea if you consider the Zelda timeline, but in a vacuum, he's pretty compelling for what he is. His selfless drive to protect everyone he loves and cares about, including his kingdom, putting his very life on the line to defeat Ganondorf. It's a very emotional moment when he sacrifices himself. And speaking of, the final memory where Zelda becomes the Light Dragon, sacrificing her very mind and soul to give Link one last opportunity to finally defeat Ganondorf once and for all. That twist about Zelda's true identity as the Light Dragon blew me away when I first got to that point in the memories. You see what I mean? This game genuinely has some amazing moments that truly stand the test of time. However, there are problems with the execution, and they come from the fundamental aspect of Tears of the Kingdom that it was literally built upon. Its absolute insistence on complete and utter freedom. You see, in Breath of the Wild, Link's memories could be searched for in a completely non-linear way, and it didn't really matter in that game considering the fact that his memories were largely unimportant to the overall story. You didn't need Link to remember everything about what happened 100 years ago if you wanted to defeat Calamity Ganon. All it did was give you, the player, a little bit more context to why you were doing this. It made things more satisfying, but it didn't make it any more necessary. Tears of the Kingdom follows the same design principle when following Zelda's memories around Hyrule, and yet it works far less effectively in this game than it did in the previous game, because Tears of the Kingdom is actually telling an in real-time story, unlike Breath of the Wild. There wasn't really a story to Breath of the Wild besides the memories, but this is completely different in Tears of the Kingdom. Ganondorf awakens and plunges Hyrule into something called the Upheaval, completely destroying everything around him. The landscape of Hyrule changes, though not nearly as much as I'd like to, but we've already talked all about that. However, everything in the present still remains relatively boring. All of the actually interesting stuff that they showed in the trailers is locked again in the past, or in weird hypothetical scenarios like that bit in Hyrule Castle where Ganondorf showed everyone a vision of what would happen when he conquered all of Hyrule. Did we really need that scene? Couldn't Ganondorf have actually got off his butt and done that himself? I tell you what, that was one of the most disappointing scenes in all of the game for me. Everyone talks about how scary and menacing Ganondorf is, and he's just gonna destroy Hyrule. Oh my goodness, you guys, be scared already. But then Ganondorf just shows up at Hyrule Castle. Instead of actually doing anything to conquer Hyrule of his own accord, he just goes,
"Oh, no guys, you misunderstand. I'm gaining strength. You thought I was going to do something cool? Ha! You idiots, you fools, you imbeciles! How about instead, I show you a hypothetical scenario of what would happen if I did conquer Hyrule myself?
You see what I mean? It just feels like nothing even remotely intriguing is allowed to happen in the present moment. I'm not sure why, maybe it's just laziness, maybe it's just because they want to do exactly what Breath of the Wild did, but either way, the story suffers for it. And don't even get me started on the regional phenomena quest. In fact, the whole Zelda's disappearance thing is so poorly written, it's abominable. The fact that you can discover Zelda's memories in any order means that you'll likely find out that she's the Light Dragon fairly early on in the game if you find the geoglyph near Death Mountain. And then if you decide to do the main story quests after discovering all of the memories, the whole thing becomes very stale and boring because you know everything. The whole plot is predicated on the fact that Zelda is missing and everyone is trying to find out where she is. But you know where she is. She's the Light Dragon, and so seeing everybody in Hyrule fall for obviously fake Zelda is just so annoying. I mean, seriously, everything about her screams, "I'm not the real Zelda," and yet somehow people are led along by the nose for no reason. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like Puppet Zelda as a villain. She reminds me of Harumi, but her use in the story feels so tacked on and lazy that it kind of hurts my soul. Especially if you do the memories out of order and discover who she truly is before this battle in Hyrule Castle against Phantom Ganon. Because if you do that, if you're one of those unlucky people, then you just have to go along with it and pretend there's a mystery. Why is it during each of the 4 main regional phenomena quests we have to see one of the new sages say, "Oh, what? Is that Princess Zelda? What is she doing?" And then Link just decides not to say anything even though he knows who the real Zelda is? This is what I mean when I say absolute freedom is severely hurting the narrative in this game. And it doesn't even feel like it could be that hard to fix. Just make it so that either 1, it doesn't really matter which geoglyph you go to, you're always going to unlock a memory that comes chronologically after the previous one you unlocked. Or 2, make it so that when Link discovers one geoglyph, the next one will just appear somewhere in Hyrule, and then that's it. This wouldn't necessarily solve all of the problems though. Just because you'd see Zelda's memories in order doesn't mean that you wouldn't be able to find out about the fake Zelda thing and be surprised by it. If you do all of the memories in order, you're still going to know the main story even before you finish it. So it feels like a lose-lose for our friend Puppet Zelda over here. Not to mention the fact that the build-up to her reveal ended up being very boring and repetitive. Not just in the Crisis at Hyrule Castle quest, but also in the previous regional phenomena quest that we did before this. We all know about the Secret Stone Demon King cutscenes, and we all know that they're super boring. But I feel like the Hyrule Castle quest goes a little bit understated. You're forced to chase Puppet Zelda around Hyrule Castle, and every time you corner her, she transforms into monsters and they attack you. And it gets old fast, yada yada. This is all stuff I've said before countless times, and it is getting stale and repetitive even in this review, which I guess is kind of an accurate representation of how it feels to play the game. And unlike the story, I don't want to repeat myself over and over, so let's put a pin in this and finish up for now. I sure have been doing a whole lot of complaining considering the fact that this is my favourite game of all time, huh? Well, the more you love something, the more critical you can be of it, because you want it to be the best it can be, you know? The Legend of Zelda is one of my favourite franchises of all time, and I want it to be its best. Obviously, I want it to continue succeeding, just as Tears of the Kingdom has, but I also don't want that to be at the cost of audience reception. Because now, a year and a half after its release, Tears of the Kingdom has been one of the most divisive Zelda games of all time. There are people who love it, and there are people who absolutely hate its guts, and to be perfectly honest, I don't really know where I stand anymore. It will always be my favourite game of all time, but not necessarily because I just unconditionally love it, but rather because it fascinates the heck out of me, and also because the things it does right, it does so unbelievably right, which I haven't really been talking about that much in this review, but I really should mention a few things. For example, the prologue. I absolutely loved it. Seeing Link and Zelda traverse what was below Hyrule Castle, what with the foreboding music and everything, it's still one of my favourite parts of the game to revisit. I feel like the game honestly truly felt like an honest-to-goodness sequel in these moments here, where everything you were doing was actually new instead of just recycled from the previous game. And this momentum continues to build throughout the first few hours of the game. The Graysky Island is also completely new content that we've never seen before, exploring new traversal opportunities with our new abilities. But then you go down to Hyrule and things start to feel eerily familiar. Sure, when you haven't explored all of Hyrule yet, you do start to wonder, oh, I'm so excited to re-explore this Hyrule, I wonder what's changed. But then you realize, oh, well, not much really has changed. I'm still fighting the exact same enemies most of the time, with the exact same armor, the exact same weapons, same music, same everything. And then you remember that this game took 6 years to make, and you wonder, I'm guessing all of that time, energy, and effort was put into maintaining and developing the abilities of the game? I mean, that's probably the reason. The depths were made in a surprisingly short amount of time according to the developers, and given how complex Ultra Hand is and the Zonai devices seem to be, and how they all interact with one another perfectly, I'm guessing this is why they did it. This is probably why the game was delayed so many times, and why it took so long to reach us, and now that it's finally here, I'm wondering whether or not it was worth it. I flip-flop on this answer so many times. I think, well, Tears of the Kingdom was worth it, because we still got a great game out of all of this. But then I think about everything else about the game. All these little things that come together to create a pretty darning picture. And then I think, well, with 6 years of development, what game could we have gotten? What if we got a completely new world with completely new characters, music, story, everything? New enemies especially. Imagine a Tears of the Kingdom with a wider enemy variety than this. Imagine if Tears of the Kingdom didn't just recycle so many things from Breath of the Wild, but also recycled so many things within the game itself. Just imagine for a second if that wasn't the case. Sometimes I think this game is too similar to Breath of the Wild. I feel like I'm playing the same game again rather than a sequel. The same plot and same storylines, just with slightly different aesthetics, and with so much recycled content in between it all. I remember one of my favorite Zelda YouTubers, Point Crow, saying something like this: "We all know the story about how Tears of the Kingdom was created. The team had so many ideas for Breath of the Wild DLC that they just decided, you know what, let's make a full sequel." And it felt like that. And you know what? It did. It really did feel like this game was just born from too many ideas and they just kind of crammed it into this cartridge. All of the different things this game tries to do don't feel very focused, do they? It feels like it's trying to do everything, and so it doesn't really succeed at all of that. It's a jack of all trades, master of none. It feels like the most time and attention got put into Ultra Hand and the other abilities. That might not be the case, but that's how it feels. In the initial few months after its release, Tears of the Kingdom was lauded with praise and admiration. People were saying that Breath of the Wild felt like a tech demo in comparison, but now I kind of feel the opposite. The most polished part of this whole game in my eyes are the abilities. Everything else feels like it just serves as a playground to test your abilities. So if anything else, Tears of the Kingdom feels more like the tech demo. The story feels so much more shallow than Breath of the Wild's. The dungeons can get pretty repetitive. The surface and other enemies on the surface feel too similar to the way they were in Breath of the Wild. And ultimately the new additions, the sky and the depths, don't feel very well fleshed out at all. And yet, somehow, after all of this game still holds a very special place in my heart. Because I will always remember just how deeply engrossed I was in it the very first time I played it. All of these criticisms didn't matter to me back in those days. I was just so enamored with everything this game did. It was this childlike wonder that just kept its grip on me and refused to let go, and has only really loosened lately. And yes, this game does have a lot of problems, and its lows go pretty low, but the highs go really, really high. And because of that, I will always remember it fondly. And it will always be my favorite game of all time. Not because it's flawless, but because even in spite of the flaws, I can always have a tremendous time with this experience. The first time in a video game that I felt truly free to explore every single possibility that crossed my mind, no matter how ridiculous it seemed to be.
Light, tremble down on your knees. I tolerate you no more. Now comes the end of peace. Behold the bringer of war. Bow to your demon king, he who history deplores, he who rules everything. Live and die by the sword. Cannot win, I'll skewer your fragile flesh. So ends your pitiful quest. Show me a warrior, bloodier, gorier, one who can give me a test for combat being blessed.
Flame through fire reveal, clash flame, the fight
was formed through red hellfire. From its forge came blood and iron, crafted into an empire, made for Ganondorf, Dragmire. Oh, too soon the feeble nascent grew dependent and complacent. So if trial they can't face, then I shall end their feeble race. Still you mortals dare stand against my iron command. Weakness will always lead to defeat by I, the superior man.
My sour to his power, now is Hyrule's final hour.
I will yet rule this land. You will not stop me. A mere mortal will not stand in my way.
Oh, and well done to Curious Critiques for managing to successfully guess every single blurred out character in the Q&A thumbnail. Congratulations for managing to guess every single obscure thing that I like.